everyone. There might be a few still trickling in. But thank you guys for coming to one of the first talks of the morning. I had prepared myself so there wasn't going to be as many of y'all. But I am so glad you're here. So today I'm going to be talking about everyday sourdough. And I'm going to be going through and clicking my slides. I'll share with you guys a little bit about me and my family here in a minute. But if I'm out of breath, it's because I'm out of breath. I'm 35 weeks pregnant. I was trying to calm myself over there, but I'm like, the truth is I'm going to be gasping by the time this is over with, okay? So just bear with me. So today we're going to be covering a few different things. We're going to be talking about what is sourdough, which I'm sure so many of you guys know. We're going to run through some of the benefits of sourdough, some of the basic equipment, right? I don't know, when I was thinking about getting started in sourdough, all I heard was how intimidating it was. Anybody feel that? And so I'm really wanting to kind of break that down and explain, hey, these are the basic things you need. It can be scary, but it can also not be. And I do not do things by the book. I am very much a feel type of person. And so you might be in the crowd and say, well, that's wrong. And you might be right. But I think if anything, it gives you grace to know that it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not a science. Do what feels right for you. Make it work, because I've certainly done that for my family. I also am going to talk about how I established a baking schedule that works for me and my family, give you guys a couple different options if you're thinking, man, this does seem like a lot of work. How do I make this work with my family dynamic? We're going to talk through fermentation, sourdough starters. I'm actually going to walk you through the 7-day process of starting your own starter from scratch. I really encourage you guys, if you can, take photos of the screens, especially when it comes to the day process. But our booth is just right over here. So if you want the presentation emailed to you, stop by my booth afterwards, put down your email, and I'm happy to send it to you next week when I get home. And then we're going to talk through some troubleshooting, stuff like that. So a little bit about me. I am Jill Ragan. I own Whispering Willow Farm with my husband, Nathan, which, fun fact, you guys, I've been speaking for years. This is only the, second time you've ever got to hear me talk. So I don't know if that calms me or makes me nervous, but he's back there hiding in the back. So we own Whispering Willow Farm. We're a small farm in central Arkansas. We're on a little over 4 acres. For years, we grew vegetables and sold to farm-to-table restaurants, wholesale, did that model for several years. This will actually be the first year that we've been in a 4-year transition to cut flowers. This will be the first year we have relinquished all of those wholesale accounts, and we are just selling cut flowers for profit. And then my husband raises sheep, pigs, chickens, all the things that makes his heart happy. And really and I should also mention, we have 3 daughters, a sweet little boy on the way. They work with us sometimes joyfully, sometimes reluctantly, but we are so glad they're actually here today. So if you see them running around, say hi to them. But my journey with sourdough kind of started not intentionally. I remember back in 2020, I started having all these weird rashes pop up, particularly on my elbows. I had no idea what was going on. Very active in the gym, very clean diet. In fact, at that point, I was working with a nutrition coach and sending all my food in. She's very particular about that. So I was kind of what is happening? But I am a carb girl, so I was eating a lot of gluten. And I reached out to my friend who was a nutritionist, and she's like, oh, I think you're having a reaction to the gluten. Have you tried sourdough? And even though I was in the farming space, that was legit the first time I had ever heard of sourdough bread. I don't know if I was living under a rock or really what was happening. And I was like, sourdough, what is that? She's like, oh, it's a fermented bread. And a lot of people who have gluten intolerances can actually tolerate sourdough because of the long fermentation process. It breaks that down. It's easier to digest. And so she kind of walked me through this process from a nutritionist standpoint. And then her husband, Sean, who actually mentored me in organic farming, taught me how to bake. So that was nice. So there were some of our best friends who walked alongside us and was like, hey, we're going to actually teach you how to do this. And what I realized is that It changed my life. Within about a month, all the bumps and the rashes went away. I kind of fell in love with the art of sourdough, right? There's so much freedom. It's so fun. It's just a slow way of doing things, which is something I really gravitate to. So that was kind of how my journey in sourdough began. Pretty humble beginnings, but now I'm thankful. We eat sourdough every single week. I've had no issues. I can tolerate it. It is primarily the only grain that we're consuming. Most of the bread products that we're using, I try to use sourdough just to kind of help with the breakdown of all of that. So first of all, let's just talk about, and like I said, many of you guys probably know this, but what is sourdough? What is the benefit of sourdough? What makes it worth all the hype and the work? Some people are like, this is just, a phase, a fad. I really don't believe that's true. I really do believe it is a healthier way. If you're going to consume carbs, just the whole breakdown. But it is a fermented bread, and how it all works is that you're capturing that wild yeast and the lactic acid bacteria. The great thing about sourdough and the fun thing is that it is known for its unique sour flavor, which I have found turns some people off, which I tell them, you can adjust that flavor. Like my family, we really like the sourness. So when I'm baking a loaf, I'm always going to put more starter than the recipe calls for, because that's what's really adding that pungent flavor. But if you don't really like that and you're like, I don't really like the sourdough flavor, one, if you bought your bread from the store, that's probably why, because they add that flavoring. It's not naturally what the sourdough bread tastes like. So that's one thing. But then cut back on the amount of starter you put in there, and you can really alter that. So I encourage you guys, if you've tried sourdough before and you're like, don't really love it, hopefully we can tweak some things throughout the day and I can convince you guys to love it. But because of this wild yeast, the lactic acid bacteria, they're going to help you break down and pre-digest the gluten, right? And so that's where those flavors come from. That's where the nutrition is actually coming from the sourdough bread. And it is different from conventional bread because conventional bread is made with added yeast. You're using the wild yeast captured from your environment. And so that's just really cool. When you think about that whole process of how it's capturing wild yeast, you're having to be less reliant on adding products in. It is super simple. I really encourage you guys, you should try it. Now let's chat through some of the benefits of sourdough. I just kind of shared with you guys my story. I was having gluten intolerances. I was able to digest it because of the long fermentation process. So one, it is super gentle on your stomach. Obviously, I am no doctor, so don't hold me to this. But if you find yourself sitting here because you're having gluten issues, I really encourage you to try it in small dosages, like maybe a half a slice of bread at a time, right? Don't go all in and eat a loaf, even though it might be super tempting to do. Because it is going to be so much easier on your stomach. It is going to be just a gentler approach for those of you who have gluten intolerances. And the cool thing is that sourdough contains those prebiotics, right? And so these prebiotics feed the beneficial bacteria in your gut. And so instead of introducing them, and so it is actually really good for your gut health. Something I get asked a lot, which not really in this stage of life, but it's how do you eat so much bread? Because I am a very carb-heavy person, but I believe it's because it's the type of bread. It is actually feeding the good bacteria in my gut, which is allowing me to digest it so much better. I'm not just sitting on it. It's not just turning to starches and sugars. My body is absorbing it and using it the way it's supposed to because of how it is created. And so I really think that once you can figure out how to incorporate it into your daily routine, you're going to start noticing a lot of health benefits, and you won't I don't ever feel guilty eating it, even with a slab of butter. And so hopefully you guys won't either. Okay, so just a show of hands, how many of you guys have heard sourdough is complicated? Sourdough is scary. I cannot even tell you how many people tell me, oh yeah, you do sourdough. That is way too involved for me. And this is what I have to say to everyone who feels this way, because I didn't really have a idea ahead of time, right? I was just introduced to this because of a problem, so I didn't really have any of these preconceived ideas of man, sourdough's scary, sourdough seems complicated, that seems like a lot of work. And so I really try to tell people when they come with that, if I can't make this work for me, There are only 3 things you need to successfully start sourdough. And the great thing is probably everyone in here has this in their pantry. Flour, water, and a vessel. Do any of you guys not have flour, access to water, or a jar at your house? Okay, so let's talk through that. And so really it is, when you think, okay, this is really complicated, this is really scary, this is really intimidating, remind yourself you need these 3 things that you already have at home. It's going to be a little bit of your time, but what do you have to lose, right? With any skill, you're going to have to work at that skill. You're going to have to improve that skill. Sourdough is no different. But for many of us, we choose this lifestyle because it's worth it. We know it's going to be more work. We know it's going to take longer, but it's something that's worth doing. It's a skill we want to pass down to the next generation. It's better for our health, better for our wellness. So I really just encourage you guys in that. So you need flour. One of the things I will say, and I have some Q&A questions already prompted, some of the common questions I get asked we'll talk about at the end. But flour matters. So think about quality, right? With anything that we are consuming, you want to make sure that you are choosing the best quality because that's going to have the best results. So opt for an organic flour. We only use bread flour. That's just how I got started. Again, I'm going to talk through some of the different flours and what they mean. But once I've established a starter and I'm just baking bread most of the, every week, I'm primarily buying a bulk organic flour from Azure Standard. You can mill your own, which I'm hoping to transition into that. That, to me, would be I would say not like an extra step you don't have to do. So don't feel like you have to mill your own flour to have your own, to see the success with it. I have started this 4 years ago, and I'm just now considering milling my own, and I'm still questioning girl, you're crazy. But we'll see. It's a challenge. We'll see. And so just remember, you need flour. Make sure it's organic. If you can, quality matters there. Water. I do recommend that you use a filtered water through whatever, if you do not have some sort of filtration system, a spring water, some sort of just filtered water you could buy at the store would work as well. And the reason why you do this is just going to act as a clean canvas for all of those microorganisms, all that wild yeast, that bacteria to come in, versus tap water, which I think this might be dependent on where you guys are. We do not have clean tap water. There are a lot of chemicals in that, so you could have things like chlorine in your tap water that will affect your loaf. And so if you are trying tap water and you start to notice you have issues, troubleshoot these 2 things, flour and water, because more than likely, those are your 2 issues, and you can alter one of those 2, and you'll have a better result in your sourdough. And then a vessel. You guys, this can be so stinking simple. I am an aesthetics girl, I'll just be honest. So I have these little tulip wax jars, and I love them, and they're so pretty, but they are so extra. You can have a mason jar, you can have a food-grade plastic jar. You can literally have whatever you have in your cabinet, and it will work just fine. I do recommend when you're creating a starter, I always start with a quart jar, and I maintain a liter jar because we're baking multiple loaves at one time. But if you're just trying to bake 1 loaf a week or something, start with a pint jar, maintain that pint jar. Don't feel like you have to if you have a quart jar and you're only feeding it enough for a pint's worth and you're like, well, it didn't bubble over like what I saw on Instagram. It's not going to, because you're not feeding it as much. So just think simple when it comes to your ingredients. And now I'm going to walk you guys through creating a sourdough starter, okay? I do have a YouTube video on this, walking through the process if you're more of a visual person. Like I said, I do recommend taking photos of the slides, and we're going to talk through in a little bit. You'll notice that I'm creating my starter with something outside of a bread flour, and we're going to talk about in a little bit why that is. So this is my sourdough starter that I created. This is not what my sourdough starter looks like now. I created this one just for the sake of a video purpose to teach people. So you'll notice it's darker. It's made with a whole wheat flour, which is going to have more proteins, which is going to cause it to activate so much faster. And so this is a 7-day process. Now, you guys, give yourself grace. Give yourself so much grace. One, I did this at a time that I knew I would be back inside at that 12 or 24-hour mark. So I chose to start mine at lunchtime because I knew at lunchtime my children needed to be fed. I was going to be back inside. So say you work a 9-to-5 job and you're starting this process at 10 a.m. when you are never going to be home for that next 6 days at that time. It's never going to work. So one, think about the timing of that when you start. But also know there's so much flexibility in this. On some of these, it goes to where we'll walk through it in a second, but where you're doing 24 hours. And it was probably way longer than that before. I did not stick to this rigid schedule when I created the starter that you see here. So just know if you're a couple hours late, don't toss it. If it is oozing over the top, that is totally fine. Give yourself grace for that. So on day one, you're going to have 1 cup, and you'll notice, too, that we're talking in cup measurements here. But moving forward, all sourdough recipes are going to be done in grams. So the best thing to do is just buy a cheap kitchen scale. They're so versatile. I love to do it to just weigh my harvest, right? Like it's a great investment for a whopping $10, okay? But you're going to have a hard time finding sourdough recipes that are not in that grams metric. And then the conversions I find aren't ever right. So I have tried to follow some. I feel like Lisa Bass at Farmhouse on Boone does a really good job with converting her recipes, and they're pretty accurate. Other than that, so if you're looking for ones that are like, hey, I'm just wanting this in cups, the grams is too overwhelming, I would really recommend you guys follow her. She does a lot of great content. But aside from that, get used to working in that grams metric because that is just how sourdough is. And I find that it's more accurate. You have more accurate loaves, recipes when you can figure that out, and just buying a scale is super simple. So on day one, you're going to add 1 cup of whole wheat flour, and we are using a quart jar. And you're going to add 1 cup of filtered water. Stir it well. Put a lid on it. You're not going to tighten it. You're never going to tighten and secure it because we need all that wild yeast to come in and act. So I literally, with my Wex jars, they have those clamps. I don't ever use the clamps. I just set the lid on top. If I had a mason jar, I would never screw the lid, like the ring on it. I would just put the lid on it. So make it to where it's not secured. It's getting oxygen. It's getting airflow. Wild yeast and bacteria can come in and do what they do. And then you're going to let it sit for 24 hours. I recommend, again, figure out that time, set an alarm on your phone, something that's going to prompt you. And then the next day, you're going to discard. Now, you're going to hear this term discard quite often. You can do different things with the discard. I don't recommend it this stage, but once you've established a starter, we save our discard, and we make so many different recipes with it. If someone wants a sourdough starter, one of my friends called and was like, I don't want to start my own. Well, I took some of my discard, gave him, fed him. Now he has an active starter. You can feed it to your animals. Our pigs and our chickens love it. So not everyone discards. I choose to. This would be one of those where there'd probably be some altering opinions, which is totally fine. I do always discard, but we always save and use our discard, so I prefer to do that. We'll make pancakes, brownies. There are so many different great discard recipes. And so the next day, you're going to discard your mixture by half. And when I say by half, I mean whatever it has risen to, you're going to take half of that out, okay? And it's going to change because the more that you're feeding it on day 4, the discard is, going to be probably way more than on day 2. So be mindful of that. The goal is that it's going to keep growing. So day 2, you're going to discard your mixture by half. Again, you're going to go back in and you're going to add 1 cup of whole wheat flour, and you're going to add 1 cup of filtered water. Stir it, put the lid back on, don't secure it, set your alarm for 24 hours. Day 3, you're going to get up, you're going to discard the mixture by half, you're going to refeed the 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of filtered water, stir. Same process as day 1 you're going to do through day 4. And then day 5 and 6 is when things get different but not scary, okay? You're going to wake up, you're going to discard that mixture. By half, you're going to refeed, but this time you're going to do it every 12 hours. So the more that you're refeeding it, like often, so if I have let a sourdough starter go dormant, which sometimes I'm bad about that, I'll create multiple ones and forget about it. and I realized, man, that's been sitting in there. Maybe there's some funky stuff on top. We'll talk about that in a second. I know it's not active. It doesn't look healthy. It has used up all of its resources, and it's just kind of flat. There's no air bubbles when it's sitting in the fridge, anything like that. I'm going to refeed it about every 2 to 4 hours to get it to activate faster. And that works really well versus if I had a healthy active starter, I'll get up in the morning, I'll feed it, I'll let it activate. By that afternoon, I can use it, and it's great. So you'll notice that why did we increase it by 12 hours? So that it is activating faster. Because at this point, you've had 4 days where you've built that wild yeast, you've built that good lactic acid bacteria, you've created that environment. So now we're just trying to speed that process up. And then on day 7, which this picture is what day 7 starter looks like for me, it should be active and ready to use. So I would go ahead and use this for my recipe. And then I'm going to refeed it, and this is where I would choose whatever flour I primarily want to bake with. I would recommend, if you're a beginner, bake with a bread flour. An all-purpose flour, you're going to have a denser loaf. We actually don't even use all-purpose flour. Anything we would use all-purpose for, we use bread flour for. So we're not buying multiple types of flour. And I literally just keep whole wheat on hand for if I'm creating a starter for someone, or like random things that might a cookie recipe or something like that. So on day 7, after you've used it, you would choose what Elkhorn, whatever type of primary flour you want to use, that's what you would refeed it with. And I would recommend, this is what I do 50 grams of the flour, 50 grams of the water. You could do, if you think you're going to be baking a ton, you could refeed 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water. The important thing is you're always refeeding equal parts. So however much flour you put in, like think back to those basic ingredients, flours and waters, that always needs to be the same amount. And then I store in the fridge, and I'm going to talk about this, I think, coming up. And so once you've baked your first loaf, if you're like, oh my gosh, I did it, now I need to breathe, pop it in the fridge, don't worry about it. Like, don't feel like you have to keep maintaining it. Don't feel like you have to keep baking loaves. We're going to talk about that in a second when I talk about my baking schedule. But you can literally just activate your starter, make that first loaf. You could even activate your starter, discard, refeed, and put it in the fridge and not even make a loaf. But you've created your sourdough starter. So now let's talk about maintaining. Once I kind of got in the sourdough scene and I would try to convince people that they needed to start making sourdough, I would hear this often. Well, I don't want to have to bake every day. I don't want to have to bake every day. Like, I've got a lot of stuff to do. And I would ask them, like, why do you think you have to bake every day? Well, that's what I've been told. I've been told I have to. And I just want to kind of debunk that for you guys. You do not have to bake every day. That is a lot of flipping work. So once you have your starter, there's maintenance, right, with anything. A garden, cooking, whatever. There are going to be some things if you want it to be healthy and thriving, but you certainly don't have to bake every day. So I talked about keeping my starter in the fridge. And so when my starter goes in the fridge, it remains dormant, which is why I feed it. So let's say I bake a loaf and I've got my active starter. I've used 50, 100 grams of that for my recipe. I always have starter left over. I'm always refeeding it the equal parts because it needs something to feed off of. So I refeed it the flour, I refeed it the water, and I stick it in my refrigerator where it can continue to live and be happy, and there's no pressure on me. And then when I get ready to bake, typically I'll talk through mine in a minute, I'll grab it out of the fridge. I'll discard by half of what's in the jar. I'll put that discard either in a separate discard jar that's labeled that in the fridge, or if I plan on baking a recipe, I'll immediately use it for that recipe. And then I refeed my starter and let it activate, and I bake my loaf. But if you are leaving your starter on the counter, that's where you have to start baking every single day. That is not manageable at all. Once you stick it in the cold refrigerator, that's when you place it into a place of being dormant, and it can stay in that dormant state. I've pushed the limits, y'all. It can stay in there for a minute. I recommend for a healthy starter, you pull it out at least every 2 weeks and feed it, even if you're just discarding, refeeding, and putting back in there. So like if we're traveling, I didn't make bread last week, not breaking bread this week. So I went ahead and like pulled my starter out, refed it, put it back in the fridge just so that it would stay healthy. But even if you think your starter's gone, I'm going to share with you guys it's not. So I just want to encourage you guys, you don't have to bake every single day. One of the ways to give yourself grace is pop it in the fridge. I do this with my loaves as well. I do a cold proof where I will, like the second proof, just stick it in the fridge because I have things to do. So I'll stick it in the fridge in the morning and then score it and bake it in the afternoon when I need it for dinner. So just know that the fridge is your friend. If you need to slow down time for a minute, just stick it in there. It'll be fine. So now let's talk about some of the different schedules, baking schedules. So for me, and when I was first starting, I did a different schedule, but I would say for the last 2 years or so, I've stuck to this schedule, and that's twice a week. So I'm baking on Tuesdays and Fridays. So I bake on Friday to last us through the weekend and through till Tuesday, and then Tuesday gets us through the week. So Tuesday, it's nothing fun, you guys. We're figuring out, I'm getting with Nathan, seeing what he's cooking. It's a focaccia, typically, because they're so much easier. We can use a lot of our garden harvest. So I'm doing a focaccia, maybe a daily loaf. And then Fridays is where I'm thinking through the kids want bagels, right? Or we're doing some sort of cinnamon roll or something that's going to take a little bit more time. I need to think through more. And then I'll still always do just like that standard loaf to get us through for sandwiches or dinners. And so I have set this up to where I'm only baking twice a week. And that's not me baking a lot. I'm typically baking on Tuesdays 2 loaves. Either that's 2 focaccias, or 2 sorts of just like daily loaf, which is your standard. The weekends when sometimes I'll get a little crazy and I'll try to bake something fun for the kids. But even if that seemed like a lot, and that is covering our bread needs. So that's what I'm doing for my family for us to not have to buy bread at the store. But you could also do a once a week schedule. And what that would look like is on Monday, you're going to feed and maintain your starter in the morning. You're going to let it sit at room temperature. On Monday evening, your starter should have activated, and so you're going to mix the dough. This is where that bulk fermentation we're going to talk about in a second comes into place. You're going to cover and leave it on the counter, and then Tuesday morning, you're going to get up and shape your dough, put it in your proofing basket. This is where I actually stick it in my fridge and go about my day, and it's kind of stopping fermentation, so it's not going to overproof. And that way, Tuesday evening, I could bake it to go with dinner. And so that's kind of my schedule. So the day before I'm actually wanting a loaf of bread is when I am getting my starter nice and active. That night is when I am starting mixing all my ingredients together. Bulk fermentation is going to take place 10 to 12 to 15 hours. That next morning, I get up before the kids. I shape it, throw it in my fridge all day, work. That evening, I bake them before dinner, and then I will store the other one. So that's a really good method to make it really easy with the rhythms of my life already, right? I'm doing it before the kids, in the evening after the kids go to bed. So again, just figure out those schedules that can work with you. And if you do this too, bake more than 1 loaf at a time so that if you think your family is going to eat and consume more than 1 loaf, you can still get by with doing it once a week. When I first started, I did a lot of this. I was working a job off the farm. Like life was just crazy, raising littles. And so I would just bake on the weekends, and I would bake in bulk, and I would freeze it. So that's another great thing. Sourdough freezes really well. I do recommend if you want to freeze it, pre-slice it. It's easier. One of the best tricks I can tell you to really get the fresh from the oven taste after it's been froze, run it underneath water and then put it back in the oven. So like when I freeze it for an event or we have family coming over or whatever, I'll still pre-bake some just to give myself time, pre-slice it or whatever, put it in freezer safe bag, get out. I've got the little spray nozzle on my faucet, wet it, pop it in the oven at 425 for about 5 to 10 minutes, and it's like it just came out. So it's going to rehydrate it. So that way you just don't have a dry loaf. Just make sure you put some moisture back into it. But one of the ways you could just stock up on the weekend is very similar to what we were just talking about. And you could even do this. You could replace Thursday for Friday to where you're baking on a Saturday. But again, you're just spending one day doing it at night and really stocking yourself up. And then you could also do every other week. So for those of you who maybe are just really, really busy, you're not looking to really replace all of your bread needs. You're just wanting to kind of get some of those health benefits in, maybe learn the skill and the craft of sourdough. You could do it on Sunday. You could feed and maintain your starter in the morning. Sunday evenings, you could mix your dough, begin that whole bulk fermentation process, leave it. And then Monday morning, you could shape your dough, place it in the proofing basket, and then just rotate this every other week. Would also be a good kind of entry level, where do I start? I don't have a lot of time. I would recommend this schedule. So I've mentioned bulk fermentation a lot. You're going to hear it in any recipe that you bake, unless it is a discard recipe, because that's more so just for the flavor, not the benefits, because you're using the discard, it's not actually active. So just be mindful of that. If you're baking with discard, it is not going to have the nutritional benefits because it's not going to have gone through this bulk fermentation. It is mainly to create another starter, to prevent waste, and to add that fun, tangy sourdough flavor. But just know you're not going to get the health benefits from a discard like you would an active starter. But by definition, bulk fermentation is just that rest period that we're talking about. You notice this takes place at night after we have added our starter with our water, our flour, our salt. And so it's a rest period where the dough is going to ferment. And during this fermentation process is where all of the goodness happens, okay? It's where it develops its flavor and its texture. So I tell people, too, if it's too sour or not sour enough, alter how much starter you're using. But also I would start to think about adjusting those fermentation times. Because if it's just not tasting like sourdough, you're not tasting that sour, pungent flavor that most of us love, and you're adding enough starter in the recipe, you're probably just not letting it ferment long. Or if your texture starts getting really weird, you might have let it ferment too long. I can always tell when fermentation goes wrong. Once you do it for a while, you'll be able to just look at your dough and be like, all right, something's not right. I still bake the bread. It's still edible. But I've kind of figured out at this point, like, oh, I let this go too long. I didn't let this go long enough. And that's good. That's one of those things, just the longer you do it, you're going to become more comfortable with it. But then the benefit of the bulk fermentation is this is where it enhances the flavor, but this process is where everything starts to break down. This is what makes it digestible. This is what makes it nutritious. This is what makes it a healthy alternative. And so just know that's what bulk fermentation means. It's really not scary at all. That was just kind of as simplified as I can make it for you guys. And now I want to talk through, and I'm going to talk through more of these, but there are going to be issues. There are going to be issues, and here are some of the issues that might come up. I also have thrown away so many starters. I would literally call my friend and be like, I killed my starter. He's like, no, you didn't. I'm like, yes, I did. I killed my starter, and I hear that a lot, and now I tell people, no, you didn't. You're fine. So we're going to talk through starter health. So if your starter looks dead, right, maybe it even has a black liquid, that's actually okay. I know most people would say no, but that is okay. Do not throw it away. You can revive it. I have done this more times than I care to admit. So what you're going to do in that case, where maybe you've put your starter in the fridge because life's busy, and then you have an oh snap moment where you're like, it's been in there for a month. You pull it out, there's a black liquid, you've killed it. Don't. This is how you're going to bring it back to life. We talked about discard and refeeding more frequently. This is where that practice would come into play. So just know a healthy starter should have a yogurt-like smell. And so keep discarding and refeeding. You are going to immediately pour off your black liquid. It's going to look kind of oozy, to be honest. Like, that's kind of the best. I don't even know if that's a good word, but there's going to be no life. That picture I showed you guys earlier with the air bubbles, there's not going to be any of that in it. You're going to think, this does not look right. Discard it, immediately refeed it. And when I say usually we're discarding by half, in this case, keep like maybe a tablespoon. Okay, you do not need a lot. You're going to discard a lot. And then refeed equal parts flour and water. And for me personally, and because I have a schedule that allows me to do this, about every 2 hours, I'm going in, because I've usually let it go for a hot minute to where I need to really revive it. So I'm discarding more frequently, mainly to try to get those smells gone. And so you don't have to do it that often, but the more often you feed it after it has kind of gone awry like that, the faster it's going to bounce back and come back to life. And then there's odd smells that come with it, which if you ever fermented, certain odd smells are okay. We actually welcome them when we ferment our food. But there are some of those odd smells in sourdough that you don't actually want. And so we're going to talk about those. And then another common thing is lack of rise. Why did my bread not rise? This is very common for beginners. And we're going to talk about that. What happens if your starter doesn't rise? What happens if your bread doesn't rise? So some of the odd smells that you might encounter is a vinegary type of smell, okay? And I really encourage to take pictures of this too, because then you can kind of troubleshoot. Once you realize what smell means what, or what, discoloration means what, and you have a solution to that, it'll be easier for you to feel confident to try to fix the problem. But if it smells like vinegar, it just means that your starter's hungry, right? It's just saying, hey, feed me. So the yeast needs to be fed. So what you would do is you would just pull it out and just feed it. And maybe if you realize, okay, I went 4 weeks before feeding my starter, let's try to see what 3 weeks does, preferably 2 weeks, right? And so there's a way you can avoid that, but that's actually a very, very common fix. Just know there's not enough there. The yeast is hungry. And then an acetone, which is what I personally dealt with a lot. It smells like nail polish remover. It's not a good one. I threw out so many starters that smelled like this. Again, you're looking for a good yogurt smell. That's what it should smell like. And so this is just actually a sign that your starter's a little stressed. Maybe it's working too hard. And so it's just the buildup of different waste products, okay? Which is actually really not that scary. And so one thing I would do different if you have that acetone smell, still discard by a lot. You're going to keep maybe a tablespoon, but it's going to be hard for you to refeed and get that smell out of your jar. So I would recommend, if that's the case, put it in a new jar and start fresh. And then you're still probably going to have to refeed at least 2 times to get that smell really gone. It will taint your bread. You don't want that. But again, I would really recommend, if that is the case, just adjust your schedule, your feeding schedule. Try to figure out what makes it happy. It's a living thing. It is alive, which is one of the reasons why I love fermentation. But when you think about that, sometimes you're like, all right, did I feed my kid today? Did I feed my starter today? There is some maintenance that took place. And until it can become second nature, I set a lot of reminders on my phone, which was great, because then it just kind of subconsciously got me into a place where now I feed my starter like I feed my kid. And it's just a part of my routine. I don't even think about it. And so if you notice that acetone smell, just adjust your feeding schedule. And also, you guys, be patient with yourself. Have grace. I am by no means an expert at all. You're going to make a loaf that is going to suck, and that is okay. You might make a loaf that you feed to your pigs or your chickens or whatever. And that is so okay. That's where you learn. And that was something, I like to be good at things. I like to, actually, I'll be honest, I like to be the best at what I do in all the things. So when I tried sourdough and I wasn't the best, that frustrated me. Well, so-and-so got it. Why can't I get it? Well, it's because it's tricky, and there are so many different environmental things. There are so many flowers involved and waters involved and where you live and your altitude. There are so many different things that this was something I had to tell myself. To be a good sourdough baker, I have to learn to have patience and have grace with myself. And this is not something you're just going to knock out of the park, but it's something that you will improve on and get better each loaf that you make. So if you make that first loaf, I'll have friends send me pictures and they're like, this is not even edible. I'm like, well, the next one maybe will be. Let's troubleshoot this. So be patient with yourself. And then a lack of rise. This is also a common issue and can be common whether you're starting out or you are an expert. But one of the things, check your starter. That's always going to be your first base, because that is primarily what is creating your bread. Always start there, okay? And so just make sure that your sourdough starter is active and healthy. If you have a sluggish starter, right, we're talking about maybe it's not getting fed as frequently, maybe it's a little stressed out, that is for sure going to affect the end result of your sourdough. And so if in doubt, feed it more often. Get it more active. That will usually always help. And then room temperature matters. So to ensure that your dough proofs at the right room temperature can affect the rise of that. And so just know that a warmer environment is ideal around 75 degrees. Cooler temperatures are going to slow your rise down. So I have tried to find some tips and tricks along the way. My husband is a polar bear, and our house stays cold all the time. You guys, I woke up in our Airbnb this morning, and I was angry. It was so cold. I was like, what? Is this necessary? So in the wintertime, my breads change drastically because he doesn't believe in heat. And so I have bought a seedling heat mat off the internet for $9, and I keep it in my sourdough corner because I know my bread is never going to rise. Well, then when you let that bulk fermentation go too long, it starts to over-ferment and over-proof, which then affects things. And so I like to really keep those ferment times and those proofing times the same. And so what I'll do is when I start that, and I'll even do it with my starter, I'll feed my starter, stick it on the heat mat, and I will put a tea pitcher over it to trap heat and humidity in there, to get it to rise as it would in summertime. And then when I put it all in my bowl to bake it or to let it ferment, I will stick that bowl with the tea towel on it on the heat mat. And that, for me, has been a really good trick. You can stick it in your oven with the light on to warm it up. We have a fireplace downstairs. I've taken them and set them by the fireplace. On the top of your refrigerator where the motor's running, there's a lot of innovative ways you can do that. And so I find that this is particularly an issue in the wintertime if you keep a cooler house and you're like, man, I knocked the sourdough out of the park in the summertime, and now everything changed. That's why. So if it's not rising, whether it's your dough, anything like that, just figure out your temperatures. And then don't rush the fermentation. It is a necessary part of sourdough to be sourdough. Hi, Charlie. Hey, Daddy's right back there, okay? And so let it ferment, right? The longer it ferments, it's going to rise. I've even sometimes woke up in the morning and I'm like, man, we've hit that 12-hour mark, but I feel like if I even just let it go 2 hours longer, it's going to have better flavor. It's going to perform better. And so I'll just kind of do that feel. Like so much of baking to me is about the feel, and I'll let it go a little bit longer. But then a good little trick for beginners is you can perform something called the float test, all right? And so when you're shaping your dough, before you shape your dough, you can just drop a small piece of your dough in a glass of water. And if it floats, then it means your dough's ready. And if it sinks, you need to let it ferment a little longer. So when you have in your bowl, literally what I do is just take like a tablespoon, and I would just scoop it out, drop it in, and it would kind of let me play around with times and figuring out what worked for me or not. So that's a good little beginner trick. And then also just make sourdough a part of your daily life. And so for me, when I was starting out, it was really important to have a manageable schedule where I wouldn't get overwhelmed, discouraged. Really build up your confidence is what I had to do. One, I encourage you, make bigger batches at a time. Maybe have friends or family come over, have a baking day. I find that that's really fun. A lot of times my friends would have, tips and tricks that I never thought of and vice versa. And so we really kind of learned off of each other. And then seek mentorship. I really attest so much of my baking to finding a friend that I could call and be like, oh my gosh, my starter smells like nail polish remover. What do I do? I did throw out a few, but then eventually I realized I had a mentor. I had a friend who I could call up. So find someone who's maybe 1 step, 2 steps ahead of you. They don't have to know it all, but maybe they know one more thing than you do, and it can help really keep you on the journey instead of being like, I'm going to throw in the towel on this. So I do want to run through, we have about 15 minutes left. I want to run through some common questions because I feel like if we ask, this would be a lot of them. I want to talk through flours real quick. So when it comes to choosing the right flour for your sourdough, it is importance to find one that suits your baking needs, your personal preferences. And so I want to talk through some of those. I actually had someone stop me earlier, and she says every time she cuts her bread, it falls flat. And we figured out it was because she was using an all-purpose flour. So if you have a really dense loaf and you're using an all-purpose flour, switch it out. That is probably primarily the reason that is happening. And so while all-purpose flour is a versatile choice, it is often recommended for beginners. I personally would recommend you start with the bread flour. But if you're like searching the internet, that's probably one of the most common. And it's a good balance of protein content and gluten development. So that's good. You're just going to notice you're going to have a denser loaf using an all-purpose. And then a bread flour has a higher protein content, which is why I'm going to recommend you guys do it, because you're going to have just a loaf that rises a lot better. When you cut into it, it's going to have a better crumb. It's going to have a chewier texture. And it's just a really great versatile flour to keep on hand. And then you have whole wheat flours, which is what we used when we created our sourdough starter. And it contains the entire wheat kernel, so the bran and the germ. It is going to totally change the texture and the flavor, okay? So it's going to add a nutty flavor. You're going to have a much denser loaf because nothing's being separated. It is every part of the wheat kernel in there. And so if I do ever use like a rye or a whole wheat, I'm adding maybe a quarter of that with my bread flour, right? Because your sourdough's just not going to look the way you probably want it to look or taste the way you want it to taste. But you can gradually mix flours too, to where you can still get, a bread and a loaf that rises well. So here's just the different protein contents are really going to affect the rise of your bread. So just be mindful of that. And then gluten-free. I get asked all the time, can you make gluten-free sourdough? If I didn't have my friend Mandy at Wild Oak Farms, I would say no. Why? That is why we eat bread, right? But I do realize some of us do have legit gluten intolerances. If you're looking for a gluten-free sourdough starter, my friend Mandy at Wild Oak Farm makes a great one, and she does have beautiful bread. But if you are trying to do this, it is possible, but it is not going to be the same. So just set your expectations appropriately, right? So it is possible to make gluten-free sourdough, and just be mindful of the different flours, right? So find one that's more popular, I guess, most commonly used. You will need to make your starter with a gluten-free sourdough or with a gluten-free flour, but just know that like the lack of gluten is going to make your bread less elastic, which is going to result in a denser loaf. That's usually the biggest complaint is I used, a gluten-free flour. It didn't rise. It's not going to. Like it's just the foundation is not there, y'all. Which is why I encourage you, if you're not like hardcore, you're just having some gluten sensitivities, try sourdough with that long fermentation, which happened for me. Now, if you're like legit have a gluten, sensitivity, I would even recommend finding someone who has created a gluten-free sourdough starter, because I think you'll see better results since that one has been alive for so much longer versus trying to start one from scratch. You might have a harder time. And just know that achieving the same structure in open crumb from a wheat-based sourdough, it's going to be challenging. So just set your expectations according to that and know that it is possible. And if that's the only way you're consuming sourdough, do it 1,000%. But it is going to look a little bit different than probably what you see if you're using a traditional flour. And then how often do you feed your starter? And so there are daily feedings, every other day, weekly feedings. I do encourage you guys figure out that feeding schedule. A lot of that is based off of your baking schedule. So for me, I'm feeding my starter twice a week because I'm baking twice a week. But you certainly do not have to feed it every single day. Again, if you're going to be gone, you're not going to be around. I would say about every 2 weeks at the longest, go in and still refeed it, even if you don't intend to use it, just to create a healthy and maintain a healthy starter. So why whole or rye for flour or for starter? So I do want to chat with you because I told you guys I don't use whole wheat a whole lot, but we did use whole wheat when we created the sourdough starter. And so a whole wheat, and you could also change that out for a rye if you had rye flour on hand. And so a whole wheat and a rye flours, they're special because they have more helpful enzymes. And so this enzyme's job is really to turn the starches in the flours into sugars. And the yeast in sourdough starter loves these sugars. So it allows it to activate so much faster. And so that is why. It is, if we did that with a bread flour, it would take way longer than a 7-day period. It's a higher protein content because it has this enzyme. It eats away at that so much faster, allowing it to activate so much faster. So I do recommend, if you're creating a starter, try a flour with that higher protein that has this enzyme in it, just for a faster result. Y'all made it. Congratulations, y'all. Yes, thank you so much. I do. Y'all are sweet. Thank you.